The call came on a Tuesday. The light, thin and white as bone china, spilled across the polished concrete floor of Daniel's office. A space so stark and minimalist, it felt more like a gallery than a workplace. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, gazing down at the city 20 stories below. It was a city he was quietly, methodically remaking in his own image, though almost no one in his personal life knew it. The phone on his vast, empty desk buzzed, a low, insistent vibration against the Danish oak. He didn't move at first. He simply watched the tiny, frantic movements of traffic, a silent symphony of organized chaos. The buzzing stopped, then started again. With a sigh, Daniel turned. He walked across the expansive room, his footsteps echoing slightly in the cathedral-like silence. The caller ID was an unfamiliar New York number. He answered, his voice calm and measured. "This is Daniel Croft." "Mr. Croft," a crisp, professional voice said on the other end. "This is Eleanor Vance from Forbes magazine. I'm a senior editor here. We're doing a cover story for our October issue on the innovators reshaping modern architecture, and your name is at the very top of our list. We'd like to schedule an interview and a photo shoot." Daniel's expression didn't change. He looked past his desk to a small, solitary photograph in a simple, silver frame. It was of his wife, Clara, smiling on their wedding day. Her eyes, full of a hope he now recognized as fragile, seemed to look right at him. He thought of her father, Richard, a man who measured worth in decibels in bank statements. He thought of her brother, Mark, whose ambition was a roaring fire that consumed everything but his own reflection. For 5 years, they had treated him as a charity case, a mildly embarrassing appendage to their successful family. "He'll never amount to anything," Richard had declared with smug finality at a family dinner just last year, a pronouncement met with silent, complicit agreement. They thought he was a dreamer, a small-time artist tinkering with house extensions and patio designs in a rented studio. They didn't know about this office. They didn't know about the skyscrapers, the international awards, the multi-billion-dollar project signed under a discreet firm name that was his and his alone. They didn't know that the world they so desperately wanted to impress was already knocking on his door. Within 1 month, their entire world, built on a foundation of arrogance and scorn, would crumble to dust. And he would be the one holding the hammer. It's a story about the difference between perceived value and true worth, isn't it? We've all felt underestimated at some point. If you've ever had to bite your tongue while someone dismissed your dreams, I think you'll understand what Daniel was about to do. I'd love to know where you're watching from today, what city or town. It's amazing to see how far these stories travel. Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories where patience and integrity win the day, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Now let's go back to the beginning of the end. The beginning of the end, though no one knew it at the time, was a Sunday dinner. The scene was Richard's cavernous dining room, a space designed to intimidate. A long mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine, reflected the stern, gilded portraits of ancestors who had, by all accounts, been just as pleased with themselves as Richard was. The air was thick with the scent of roasted lamb and self-congratulation. Daniel sat quietly, a ghost at the feast, next to his wife Clara. She kept shooting him small, nervous glances, as if afraid he might use the wrong fork and bring shame upon the family name, which was, of course, her name. Her father's name, Sterling. Richard Sterling, patriarch and purveyor of high-end commercial real estate, held his wineglass aloft. His face was florid, his eyes small and sharp. "To family," he began, a toast that was always a prelude to a performance, "and to success." His gaze swept the table, landing pointedly on his son, Mark. "I have to say how proud I am of Mark. A promotion at 31, junior vice president at Henderson Global. He's a real shark, this one, following in his old man's footsteps." Mark, handsome in a bland corporate way, preened. He adjusted his tie. Thanks, Dad. It's all about closing. You hunt, you close. Simple as that. He looked across the table at Daniel. So, Daniel, what have you been up to? Still drawing those little house plans? The question was coated in a thin veneer of politeness, but the condescension underneath was structural. Daniel met his gaze without flinching. He had a stillness about him that the Sterlings mistook for weakness. They were people of loud gestures and booming voices. They didn't understand the language of quiet. I'm working on a few residential projects, yes, Daniel said, his voice even, and a small community proposal. Community proposal? Richard scoffed, taking a large bite of lamb. Pro bono, I assume? For the birds and squirrels? He laughed, a harsh, barking sound. Mark joined in, a higher-pitched echo. Clara placed a hand on Daniel's arm, a gesture meant to be soothing, but it felt like a restraint. Dad, Daniel's work is very creative. It's more of an art. This was her constant defense of him, and it was a defense that damned him in her family's eyes. Art was what people did when they couldn't do business. It was a hobby, not a profession. Daniel didn't see himself as an artist. He saw himself as a problem solver, an engineer of space and light. But he let the mischaracterization stand. It was a useful camouflage. Art doesn't pay the mortgage, sweetheart, Richard said, waving his fork. Look, Daniel, I'm sure you're a nice guy. My daughter seems to think so anyway. But you've been married 5 years. When are you going to get a real job? Join the real world. I could get you a position in Henderson's mailroom. At least it's a start. Something with a career path. The humiliation was so casual, so profoundly dismissive, it was almost elegant in its cruelty. It wasn't an attack, it was a statement of fact, as Richard saw it. Daniel was a failure, a project for Clara to manage, a man who would never, ever amount to anything. Daniel felt Clara's hand tighten on his arm. He looked at her. Her face was flushed, her eyes pleading with him not to react, not to make a scene. Her loyalty was to peace, not to him. In that moment, he saw with piercing clarity that her love for him was conditional on him never challenging the family hierarchy. He gave a small, slow nod. Thank you for the offer, Richard. I'll certainly keep it in mind. His calmness was infuriating to them. They wanted him to argue, to get defensive, to prove their assessment of him as an emotional, unstable artist. When he didn't, they were left with only the echo of their own arrogance. Under the table, out of sight, Daniel's hand rested on the worn leather of the simple portfolio he always carried. It was old, the corners softened with use, the strap frayed. To them, it probably looked like it held a few amateur sketches. They had no idea it contained the preliminary blueprints for the new waterfront development in Singapore, a project valued at just under $1 billion. He felt the smooth, cool surface of the leather under his fingertips. Patience, he told himself. A building is not erected in a day. First, you must lay the foundation, and sometimes before you can build, you must clear the ground. The dinner conversation moved on, leaving him in its wake, an irrelevant island. But Daniel was not adrift. He was anchored, waiting for the tide to turn. And he knew, with the certainty of a master architect reading a blueprint, that the tide was already turning. They just couldn't see the water rising around them. The humiliation, like a well-structured narrative, required escalation. The next major beat in the Sterling family's symphony of scorn came 2 months later, at Richard's lavish 60th birthday party. The event was held at a country club where the membership fees alone exceeded Daniel's supposed annual income. The air hummed with the quiet clinking of expensive glasses and the murmur of conversations about stock portfolios and European holidays. Daniel, in a well-tailored but unassuming suit, was a shadow moving through a world of blinding light. He had learned to make himself small, to nod and smile, to become part of the furniture. It was a survival tactic, but it was also a strategy. The less they saw him, the more he could see them. Clara, in a stunning emerald green dress that shimmered under the chandeliers, clung to his arm. Tonight, her anxiety was palpable. She was a diplomat navigating a fragile truce, constantly trying to position Daniel away from the main currents of conversation, shielding him from her father and brother. "Just try to enjoy yourself," she whispered, her smile tight. It wasn't a request, it was an instruction. The centerpiece of the evening was, inevitably, Richard's speech. He stood on a small, elevated stage, bathed in a soft spotlight, a king addressing his court. He spoke of his journey, his hard work, his vision. He thanked his clients, his business partners, his long-suffering wife who stood beside him, beaming with practiced adoration. Then he came to his children. "And to my son, Mark," Richard boomed, his voice thick with emotion that might have even been genuine. "My successor, my pride. He just closed the largest deal in his division's history, a true sterling. He makes me feel like my legacy is in safe hands." The room erupted in applause. Mark stood and gave a small, regal bow. Richard's gaze scanned the room and, for a fleeting moment, it passed over Daniel. There was a flicker of something, not malice, but utter disregard. It was the look one gives to a waiter, a piece of background scenery. He then turned to Clara. "And my beautiful daughter, Clara, she has the biggest heart, always trying to save the world, taking in strays." He chuckled, and a few people in the inner circle, who understood the coded insult, laughed along with him. Daniel was the stray. Clara's face froze in a pained smile. She squeezed Daniel's hand, a desperate, silent apology. The speech concluded without another mention of him. He hadn't expected a tribute, but the pointedness of the omission was a public branding. He was not family. He was not a success. He was not even present in any way that mattered. As the applause died down, a business associate of Richard's, a man named Henderson, clapped Daniel on the shoulder. "Tough act to follow, eh? Don't worry, son. We all have our own path. My wife's nephew is an artist, makes lovely little ceramic pots." He meant it to be kind, but it was just another form of dismissal. Later, as a jazz trio played softly in the corner, Clara led Daniel out onto a terrace overlooking the golf course. The night air was cool. "I'm so sorry, Danny," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He's from a different generation. He doesn't understand your path." "My path?" Daniel asked quietly, his voice devoid of accusation, which made the question heavier. "What do you think my path is, Clara?" "You're a creative," she said, repeating the familiar, useless mantra. "You see the world differently. You're not driven by money and status like they are. It's what I love about you." But even as she said it, her eyes darted back toward the brightly lit room, toward the center of power where her father held court. She loved his perceived lack of ambition because it made him safe. He would never outshine her family. He would never challenge their worldview. He was her personal rebellion, but a tame one, kept on a very short leash. "They think I'm a failure, Clara," Daniel stated, not as a question, but as a simple fact. "And you say nothing." "What can I say?" she cried, her voice rising in frustration. "Argue with them? Make a scene at my father's birthday? That would only make it worse. They'd say I was being defensive, and it would just prove their point." "So we let the lie stand?" he asked. "It's not a lie, it's just their opinion," she finished lamely. Daniel looked out at the perfectly manicured green, a landscape of artificial perfection. He reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers brushing against the smooth, cool surface of his phone. On it were the final renderings for the Serenity Towers in Dubai, two twisting columns of glass and steel that looked as if they were dancing. The project had just been greenlit. The commission alone was more than Richard Sterling's company would net in a decade. He felt a cold, hard anger crystallizing in his chest. It was not a hot, explosive anger, but a patient, structural one. The anger of a man who designs foundations and understands load-bearing walls. He had been bearing the load of their condescension for years, absorbing it, letting it settle. But every structure has its breaking point. He said nothing more. He simply put his arm around his wife, held her for a moment, and then guided her back into the party. He smiled his quiet smile, nodded to the people who ignored him, and endured. But something inside him had shifted. The desire for peace had been replaced by a need for truth. Not a loud, angry truth, but a quiet, undeniable truth, presented with the cold, hard clarity of a blueprint. He would let them have their moment. He would let them build their castle of arrogance as high as they wished. He knew, with an engineer's certainty, that the higher they built on a faulty foundation, the more spectacular the collapse would be. And he was beginning to realize he no longer had any interest in saving them from the fall. Nature, it seemed, had a flair for dramatic irony. 3 months after the birthday party, the foundation of Richard Sterling's own life, his ostentatious mansion in the most exclusive suburb, began to crack. Not metaphorically, literally. A hairline fracture appeared in the marble floor of the grand foyer, snaking its way from the base of a Grecian-style column toward the dining room. Within a week it had widened. Other cracks appeared in the plaster of the living room walls. A door jammed. Richard, a man who believed that paying a premium guaranteed perfection, was apoplectic. He did what he always did. He threw money at the problem. On Mark's glowing recommendation, he hired the best structural engineering firm in the state, a company called Apex Solutions. They arrived in a fleet of shiny trucks, their team leaders striding about the property with an air of grave importance, feeding Richard's belief that a serious problem required a serious-looking and seriously expensive solution. The following Sunday, the family gathered again. This time the mood was not celebratory, but fraught with the drama of the cracking house. The air smelled not of roasted lamb, but of dust and anxiety. Apex Solutions had delivered their verdict that morning. Richard held their report in his hand, his face a mask of thunderous indignation. "Can you believe this?" he bellowed, slamming the leather-bound report on the coffee table. "They say the entire Western Wing's foundation is unstable. Subgrade water erosion. They have to excavate, install a new drainage system, reinforce the footings with helical piers. The quote is nearly $500,000. Mark, ever the sycophant, shook his head in performative sympathy. "It's a huge number, Dad, but these guys are the best. You can't cut corners on something like this. You have to protect your asset." The word asset hung in the air, a reminder that this house was not just a home, but a monument to Richard's success. Daniel had been listening quietly. He had spent 20 minutes that morning, before the others arrived, walking the perimeter of the house. He'd examined the soil, the grading of the landscape, the placement of the gutters. He'd knelt down and looked at the exposed concrete of the foundation where it met the earth. He had seen not a catastrophe, but a simple, common error. He cleared his throat. The room fell silent. It was rare for him to volunteer an opinion on any matter of substance. "Richard," he began, his voice calm, "I took a look this morning. I don't think the problem is that severe." Richard turned to him, his eyebrows raised in disbelief. "Oh, you don't? And what are you, a foundation expert now? I thought you designed sunrooms." The insult was reflexive, automatic. Daniel ignored it. "The issue isn't widespread erosion, it's a single point of failure. The downspout on the northwest corner is draining directly against the foundation wall, and the grading right there is sloped back toward the house. For years, all the rainwater from that entire roof section has been pooling and saturating the ground in one specific spot." He spoke with a quiet authority that was unsettlingly new to them. "You don't need to excavate the whole wing. You need to fix the grading, install a proper French drain to divert the water away from that corner, and then you can patch the cosmetic cracks inside. The structural damage is minimal and localized." "And how much would your little fix cost?" Mark sneered. "Maybe $20,000, Daniel replied evenly. 30 at the most. A heavy silence descended on the room. The disparity between the two figures, $500,000 versus 20,000 was so vast it was comical. Richard stared at Daniel, his face a battleground of conflicting emotions. For a fleeting second, a sliver of doubt in Apex's assessment might have entered his mind, but it was quickly overwhelmed by pride. To accept Daniel's diagnosis would be to admit that this quiet, unimpressive man he so openly disdained knew more than the expensive experts he had hired. It would be an intolerable reversal of the established order. $20,000, Richard finally said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Of course. What were we thinking? We should have just called the local handyman. Thank you for your input, Daniel, but I think we'll trust the professionals at Apex. He turned his back on him, effectively ending the conversation. What would you know about large-scale structural engineering? Stick to designing patios, son. Clara looked at the floor, her shame a palpable presence between them. She knew Daniel was brilliant. She had seen his work, the complex schematics and elegant solutions he designed for his small projects. But she was a creature of her father's world, a world where the price tag was a measure of quality, and a confident pronouncement was worth more than a quiet truth. She said nothing. They paid Apex the $500,000. The work was disruptive, loud, and took 2 months. The lawn was destroyed and then replaced at enormous cost. Richard complained endlessly about the expense, but he did so with a certain pride. It became a new story to tell, a testament to the scale of his life, where even his problems were bigger and more expensive than anyone else's. Daniel watched it all unfold. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't need to. He simply made a phone call, a discreet one. The call was to a man named Arthur Vance, the venerable and universally respected founder of Vance Construction, the largest and most reputable development company in the country. Daniel had worked with him on several major projects. Unbeknownst to the Sterlings, Vance Construction had a small, elite diagnostics division that sometimes consulted for other firms. Daniel had asked him, as a personal favor, to get him the raw data from the Apex Geological Survey at Richard's house. 2 days later, Arthur Vance called back. His voice was grim. "Daniel, it's just as you suspected. The problem was the downspout. Apex's own soil saturation report shows the issue is hyper-localized. They've manufactured a crisis. This quote, 'It's not just an overcharge, it's fraud.' Plain and simple." Daniel stood in his silent, sunlit office, looking down at the city. "Thank you, Arthur. I appreciate you confirming it." "What are you going to do?" Arthur asked. Daniel looked at the photo of Clara, at her bright, hopeful, naive smile. "I'm going to prepare a presentation," he said softly. "It's time for a design review." In his mind, he could see the structure of the coming confrontation, as clear and precise as a set of blueprints. Every beam, every joint, every load-bearing wall of their arrogance. And he knew exactly where to place the charges. The weeks that followed were a study in quiet preparation. While Richard's mansion was a cacophony of jackhammers and construction crews, a physical manifestation of his profligacy, Daniel's life was a model of silent, focused action. He was preparing for a battle, but his weapons were not anger or resentment. They were facts, documents, and the unassailable truth. This was the quiet before the storm, a period of gathering force that the Sterlings, in their noisy world, were completely deaf to. The catalyst had been the confirmation of Apex's fraud. It was no longer just about enduring condescension. It was about watching his wife's family be swindled due to their own snobbery, a snobbery directed squarely at him. The injustice of it had a crystalline purity. It was the final piece of data he needed to move from a defensive to an offensive posture. His worn leather portfolio became the repository for his case. It was a symbolic choice. The object they had so often seen and dismissed, the symbol of his supposed insignificance, would become the vessel of their undoing. Into it, he began to place documents, each one a carefully chosen stone that would build a wall of evidence so high they could not hope to see over it. First, he printed the financial statements for his firm, Croft Design Principles. He had intentionally kept the name understated. To the outside world, it sounded like a one-man consultancy. He had never lied about it. He had simply allowed them to draw their own, incorrect conclusions. The documents showed a 5-year growth trajectory that was nearly vertical, with annual net profits that now dwarfed Richard Sterling's entire real estate empire. Next, he gathered the contracts, not for small residential extensions, but for the projects he had been leading under the firm's name: the Singapore waterfront, the Serenity Towers in Dubai, and, most importantly, a project much closer to home, the Phoenix Tower, a new 50-story skyscraper set to be the crown jewel of their city's skyline. He had the master agreement signed by the city's development council, naming Croft Design Principles as the lead architectural and engineering firm. Then he did something that felt both strategic and deeply personal. He called his contacts at Henderson Global, Mark's company. He learned that Mark's recent promotion to junior vice president had been almost entirely contingent on his claim that he had personally secured Henderson's involvement in the Phoenix Tower project. Mark had presented it as his triumph, a deal he had landed through his own tenacity and connections. The truth, which Daniel knew but no one at Henderson did, was that Daniel had arranged for the initial meeting. He had anonymously fed the opportunity to Mark's division, curious to see what his brother-in-law would do. Would he be honest? Would he acknowledge the source? Or would he claim it as his own? Mark's choice had been predictable. Daniel printed the email chain, the one where Mark boasted to his superiors about his contact and his groundwork. Finally, he compiled the evidence regarding the foundation. He had Arthur Vance's signed affidavit, a damning expert opinion from the most respected name in the industry. It detailed, in cold, technical language, the fraud perpetrated by Apex Solutions, and explicitly stated that Daniel's initial $20,000 assessment had been entirely correct and professionally astute. As he assembled his arsenal, he observed his wife. Clara was torn. She was relieved that the unpleasantness about the foundation was being handled by professionals, yet she was troubled by Daniel's increasing distance. He was polite, kind even, but a pane of glass had descended between them. He was in a place she couldn't reach, and it frightened her. One evening she found him in his home study, the portfolio open on his desk. She saw the columns of figures, the dense legal language of the contracts. "What is all that?" she asked, her voice laced with a nervous curiosity. "Just preparing for a presentation," he said calmly, not looking up. "A presentation? For who? Is it a new client?" Her tone was that of a concerned parent, worried he was getting in over his head. "Danny, please, don't overextend yourself. You know how my father can be. If you're trying to impress him, it will only backfire." He finally looked up at her. His eyes were clear and calm, but there was an intensity in them she had never seen before. "I'm not trying to impress him, Clara. I'm trying to be understood." He closed the portfolio, the soft click of the latch echoing in the quiet room. "There's a family lunch at your father's house this Sunday to celebrate the completion of the foundation work. I thought it would be a good time to share my project." A wave of dread washed over her. She pictured Daniel standing up with his little portfolio, showing off a modest design for a library or a park bench, only to be met with her father's booming sarcasm and Mark's cruel smirks. She imagined the awkward silence, the pitying looks. "Oh, Danny," she said, her voice soft with pity. "Are you sure that's a good idea? Maybe you should just email it to them later." "No," he said, his voice gentle but utterly immovable. "It needs to be done in person." She didn't understand. She saw it as a desperate, misguided attempt to win their approval, an act doomed to fail. She could not see that it was not an application for acceptance. It was a declaration of war. He was not asking for a seat at their table. He was preparing to flip the table over. and as he tucked the portfolio under his arm, he felt not malice, but a profound, weary sense of necessity. The lie had been allowed to stand for too long. It had cracked the foundation of his marriage and his own self-respect. It was time to bring the whole rotten structure down. The Sunday of the reckoning arrived under a pristine, cloudless sky. The Sterling mansion, its lawn now a perfect, seamless carpet of emerald green, looked immaculate. The scars of the recent excavation were gone, buried under a layer of expensive sod. It was a potent symbol of the family's philosophy. Any problem, no matter how deep, could be covered over with enough money. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with smug satisfaction. Richard was in his element, holding court in the living room, a glass of scotch in hand. The $500,000 repair was no longer a source of stress, but a badge of honor, a story he told with relish. It was proof of his ability to weather any storm, to command the best, to pay any price. "You see," he said to a visiting cousin, "you get what you pay for. We could have listened to some amateur opinion and slapped a bit of paint on it, and the whole wing would have collapsed in a year. But we did it right, solid as a rock now." His eyes flicked to Daniel, who was standing by the window, a silent observer, as always. The jibe was clear. Mark arrived late, bursting into the room with the frantic energy of a man who believes he is the center of the universe. "Sorry, everyone. I was on a call, closing another deal." He clapped his father on the back. "Dad, you're not going to believe this. The Phoenix Tower deal? It's officially ours. Henderson Global is the partner of record. My name is on the press release. Junior partner, here I come." Richard's face lit up with incandescent pride. He raised his glass. "To Mark! I knew it. I knew you had it in you. The Phoenix Tower. That's the biggest project this city has seen in 20 years. He turned to the family. "My son, a key player in the Phoenix Tower project. A true sterling." Clara rushed to hug her brother, her face glowing with familial pride. She looked over at Daniel, a complex expression on her face, a mixture of excitement for her brother and a familiar gentle pity for her husband, who was so clearly being left behind by life's great race. They moved into the dining room for lunch. The conversation was dominated by Mark's triumph. He held forth on the complexities of the deal, the powerful people he'd met, the bright future of his firm, and by extension, himself. He used words like synergy and leverage and paradigm shift. It was a performance of corporate speak, and his audience was rapt. Daniel ate his food slowly, methodically. He said nothing. He simply listened. He let them build the monument to their success, brick by verbal brick. He let them climb to the very top of their pedestal, basking in the glow of their perceived victory. He knew the fall was always more dramatic from a greater height. Finally, as dessert was being served, a ridiculously complex tiramisu that Richard praised for its expense, Daniel placed his fork and knife neatly on his plate. He dabbed his lips with his napkin. Then, he pushed his chair back slightly and stood up. Every head turned. Daniel never made speeches. He never sought the spotlight. His sudden movement was an aberration, a disruption of the natural order. "If I could have a moment," he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the chatter with surgical precision. "I have a small presentation of my own I'd like to share." A wave of confused silence washed over the table. Richard stared at him, a look of bemused irritation on his face. "A presentation? Daniel, we're having dessert. Can it wait?" "I don't think so," Daniel replied, his tone polite but unyielding. "I think the timing is perfect." Mark smirked, leaning over to whisper something to Clara, who shot Daniel a look of pure panic. "Daniel, don't," she mouthed silently, her eyes wide with dread. Daniel ignored her. He walked to the head of the table where he had left his old leather portfolio. He picked it up and placed it on the vast, polished surface of the mahogany table. The contrast was stunning. The grand, imposing table, a symbol of Richard's wealth and power, and the simple, worn portfolio, a symbol of Daniel's supposed insignificance. The portfolio sat there like a quiet, undeniable fact in a room full of loud opinions. "What's this, Daniel?" Richard asked, his voice dripping with condescending patience. "More of your drawings? A new patio for a neighbor?" "Something like that," Daniel said. He unfastened the two simple latches. The soft clicks sounded like gunshots in the silent room. He reached inside, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He was no longer a spectator. He was the architect of this moment, and he was about to reveal the design. Daniel did not pull out a rolled-up blueprint or a glossy architectural rendering. The first thing he placed on the polished mahogany was a single, unassuming sheet of paper. It was a page from a standard financial report, dense with numbers. He slid it across the table toward Richard. "I know how much you value a healthy bottom line, Richard," Daniel said, his voice as calm as a frozen lake. "So I thought I'd start with this. It's the summary page of the profit and loss statement for my small firm, as you call it. The final column is the net profit for the last fiscal year." Richard picked up the paper with an air of bored indulgence, as if humoring a child. He glanced at it. His eyes scanned the page, and then they stopped. He looked again, his brow furrowed in confusion. He squinted, bringing the paper closer to his face. The number at the bottom of the page was clear, precise, and utterly impossible. He looked up at Daniel, his mouth slightly agape. "This is a mistake," Richard stammered. "A typo." "There's no mistake," Daniel said. "The net profit of my company last year was just over $97 million. A collective gasp went through the room. The figure was astronomical, an amount that recontextualized everything. It was more than Richard's own company, a business he'd spent 30 years building, had made in the last 5 years combined. What company?" Mark demanded, his voice sharp with disbelief. "Croft Design Principles? That's just you in a rented room." "It started that way," Daniel acknowledged with a small nod. "But it grew. I have a staff of 40, with offices in New York, London, and here. We specialize in large-scale, structurally complex projects. We just prefer to maintain a low public profile." He let that sink in. The quietness they had mistaken for failure was, in fact, a deliberate strategy. He then reached back into the portfolio. The second document he produced was a thick, bound contract. He didn't slide this one across the table. He opened it to a specific page, one bearing a grand, official-looking letterhead. "The Phoenix Tower Development Consortium." "Mark," Daniel said, turning his attention to his brother-in-law, whose face had gone pale. "Congratulations on the Phoenix Tower deal. It's a landmark project. It will redefine the city's skyline." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "I should know. I designed it." He turned the contract around for everyone to see. There, on the signature page, under the heading, "Lead Architect and Chief Structural Engineer," was his name. Daniel Croft, Principal, Croft Design Principles. Mark stared at the document as if it were a serpent. "No," he whispered. "No, that's not possible. Henderson Global is the partner of record. We brought the deal in." "Henderson Global is a subcontractor," Daniel corrected him gently. "A valuable one, certainly. My firm hired them 3 weeks ago to consult on the retail space allocation for the first 5 floors. It's a minor but important part of the project." He then pulled out another document, an internal Henderson Global email. "I believe this is the email where you informed your superiors that you had personally cultivated the relationship and landed the client being me, Mark. I fed your division the opportunity, anonymously. I wanted to see if the man my wife called her brother had enough integrity to acknowledge he hadn't earned it. You claimed it as your own victory to secure a promotion. A promotion, I now see, that was built on a lie." The color drained completely from Mark's face. He looked like he had been physically struck. His triumph, his great success, had just been revealed as a pathetic charade, a scrap handed to him by the very man he despised. Clara was staring at Daniel, her eyes wide with a confusion so profound it bordered on terror. It was as if the man she had been married to for 5 years had been replaced by a stranger. The quiet, unassuming artist was gone, and in his place was a man of immense, hidden power. But Daniel was not finished. There was one more piece of the structure to address. "And that brings me to the foundation of this house," he said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more serious. He turned his gaze back to Richard, who sat frozen, the financial statement still clutched in his hand. "You paid $500,000 for a $20,000 problem," Daniel stated simply. "You were defrauded. And you were defrauded because you chose to trust a flashy sales pitch from an expensive firm over a quiet truth from someone you refuse to respect." The experts at Apex," Richard began, his voice weak. "The experts at Apex lied to you," Daniel said, and as he spoke, the doorbell rang. A moment later, the housekeeper showed a man into the dining room. He was in his late 60s, with a mane of white hair and an undeniable air of authority. It was Arthur Vance. Richard's eyes widened in shock. Arthur Vance was a legend in the development world, a man Richard had spent his entire career trying to emulate and impress. "Arthur!" Richard exclaimed, scrambling to his feet. "What are you doing here?" Arthur Vance did not look at Richard. He walked directly to Daniel and shook his hand. "Daniel, I came as you asked." He then turned his cool, appraising gaze on Richard. "Richard, I'm here on Daniel's behalf, and as an expert witness, should it come to that, my firm reviewed the data from Apex Solutions. They committed textbook fraud. The report I prepared for Daniel confirms his initial diagnosis was 100% correct." He placed a slim, bound document on the table next to Daniel's portfolio. It landed with a soft, final thud. "Apex is already under investigation by the state licensing board, partly due to the reckless and unsubstantiated endorsements they received from employees at Henderson Global." He glanced meaningfully at Mark. It seems a certain junior executive was getting kickbacks for his recommendations. The room fell into a silence so deep it felt like the pressure in their ears had dropped. Every lie, every piece of arrogance, every casual cruelty had been systematically dismantled and laid bare. Mark was not a shark. He was a bottom feeder, implicated in a fraud. Richard was not a savvy businessman. He was a fool, swindled by his own snobbery. And Daniel, the quiet failure, the stray, the man who would never amount to anything, was the most powerful person in the room. He was the architect of their world, and they had never even known it. He had not raised his voice. He had not used a single insult. He had simply presented the truth. And the truth, in its quiet, unassailable power, had brought their entire world crashing down. The immediate aftermath was a tableau of shattered illusions. Richard Sterling, a man whose entire identity was built on a foundation of booming confidence, sank back into his chair. He looked smaller, deflated, as if the air had been let out of him. His eyes, which were usually sharp and dismissive, were now wide and vacant, darting from Daniel's calm face to the damning documents on the table, to the imposing figure of Arthur Vance. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The engine of his arrogance had stalled. Mark was a different picture of collapse. His was a frantic, desperate implosion. His face, which had been pale, was now slick with a sheen of cold sweat. "Kickbacks? That's a lie," he stammered, his voice cracking. He looked wildly around the room, searching for an ally, a friendly face. He found none. "I didn't. Daniel, you can't do this. This will ruin me. My career." "Your career?" Daniel's voice was still quiet, but it held a new edge, the cold, hard edge of a surgeon's scalpel. "Your career was built on a lie you told about my work. You didn't earn that promotion, Mark. You stole it. And you were so arrogant in your theft that you got involved in a criminal enterprise. Consequences are not something I am doing to you. They are something you have earned." The moral clarity of his statement was absolute, leaving no room for argument. Arthur Vance, seeing his part in the drama was over, gave a slight nod to Daniel. "My report has my contact information, Richard," he said, his tone all business. "You have a strong case for a civil suit against Apex. I'd advise you to pursue it." He then turned and, without another word, was shown out, his departure leaving a vacuum of power that only Daniel could fill. All eyes now turned to Clara. Throughout the revelation, she had been frozen, a statue of disbelief. Now the ice was breaking, and the emotions underneath were chaotic. Tears streamed down her face, silent and unceasing. She looked at Daniel, her husband, and saw a complete stranger. The gentle, unassuming man she had tried to protect from her family's cruelty had just revealed himself to be more powerful and successful than all of them combined. Her protection had not only been unnecessary, it had been an insult. "Why?" she whispered, the word a fragile puff of air in the heavy silence. "Why didn't you tell me any of this?" Daniel finally turned his full attention to her. His gaze was not angry. It was not triumphant. It was filled with a profound and weary sadness. "Tell you what, Clara, that your father's assessment of me was wrong, that your brother was a cheat. I thought my character should have been enough. I thought you, of all people, saw me." He let the words hang in the air, each one a small, sharp stone. "I wanted to build a life with you based on who we were, not what we had. But I slowly realized that you were ashamed of me, not for who I was, but for who you thought I was. You loved me, I think, but you were embarrassed by my apparent lack of success in a world you were taught to value above all else." He took a step closer to her, his voice dropping even lower, an intimate confession in a room full of wreckage. "So I waited. I waited to see if you would ever defend me. Not my career, not my potential, but me, the man you married. I needed to know if you loved me or if you loved the idea of success your father sold you. I needed to know that our foundation was real." He looked around the opulent, soulless room. It turns out this house wasn't the only thing with structural problems. The quiet devastation of his words was more potent than any shout could have been. He wasn't just exposing her family's hypocrisy, he was exposing the flaw in their marriage. Her silence, her failure to stand for him, had not been peacekeeping. It had been a betrayal. Richard finally found his voice, a hoarse, broken version of its former self. "Daniel, son, I had no idea." Daniel looked at his father-in-law. The fire of righteous anger had cooled, leaving behind the cold ashes of resolution. "That's the point, Richard. You had no idea because you never looked. You never asked. You saw what you wanted to see, a failure who made your own success, and your son's, seem all the more impressive." He began to gather his documents, placing them back into the worn leather portfolio with the same deliberate care with which he had removed them. Each paper represented a truth they had ignored. He closed the latches. The clicks echoed the finality of a chapter ending. "I won't be staying for dessert," he said to the room at large. He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the frame. He looked back at Clara, her face a mask of grief and confusion. "I'm going to go home. Our home. You have a choice to make, Clara. You can stay here, in this house of cards, or you can decide what kind of foundation you want to build your life on." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked out, his footsteps firm and even on the marble floor. He left behind a scene of utter devastation, not of property, but of pride. The Sterling family, so confident, so secure, so utterly sure of their place in the world, had been brought low not by an enemy, but by a mirror. Daniel had simply shown them who they really were, and the reflection was unbearable. The weeks following the disastrous Sunday lunch were a slow, painful unfolding of consequences. The shock waves from Daniel's revelations radiated outwards, rearranging the landscape of their lives with the force of a tectonic shift. For the Sterlings, it was a winter of brutal reckoning. Mark faced the most immediate and catastrophic fallout. Arthur Vance's implication of kickbacks was not an idle threat. An internal investigation at Henderson Global, spurred by the potential scandal of being associated with a fraudulent contractor on a project as high-profile as the Phoenix Tower, moved with ruthless speed. Mark's lies about securing the project, combined with a paper trail of suspiciously large consulting fees from Apex Solutions, were undeniable. He was fired within the week. The termination was quiet, but the reason, gross misconduct, leaked into the tight-knit business community. His career, the one he had preened and boasted about, was not just stalled, it was obliterated. He became a pariah, the subject of hushed, pitying conversations at the very country clubs where he had once been celebrated. Richard's downfall was slower, more of a creeping decay. The news of his being swindled by Apex, a story he had initially told with a kind of perverse pride, now painted him as a fool. Worse, the story of his son-in-law, the silent genius he had openly mocked, became a piece of delicious industry gossip. It undermined the very core of his image, the shrewd, all-knowing patriarch. Business associates began to treat him differently, with a new, subtle reserve. Deals that had once been easy now required more effort. His authority, which had seemed as solid as granite, was revealed to be brittle. His company began to suffer, not from a single catastrophic event, but from 1,000 tiny cuts of diminished respect. But the most profound and complex struggle was Clara's. As Daniel had instructed, she had to make a choice. In the immediate aftermath of his departure, she had stayed at her father's house, trapped by shock and a lifetime of ingrained loyalty. But the atmosphere was toxic. Her father's deflated silence and her brother's frantic, self-pitying panic were suffocating. They didn't speak of Daniel with newfound respect, but with a bewildered resentment. He had humiliated them. He had broken the rules of their world. After 2 days of this, Clara packed a bag. She didn't go to the home she shared with Daniel. She couldn't face him yet. She checked into a hotel in the city, a neutral space where she could think. For the first time in her life, she was truly alone, stripped of the context of her family and her marriage. She replayed Daniel's words over and over. "I needed to know if you loved me, or if you loved the idea of success your father sold you." The truth of it was an agony. She had loved Daniel's gentleness, his quiet creativity, his difference from the aggressive ambition of her father and brother. But had she loved it enough? She had to admit, with a shame that burned, that she had also been quietly embarrassed. She had cringed at her father's jokes about him. She had wished in secret that he were a little more successful, a little more like them. She had never said stop to her father. She had never told Mark his condescension was unacceptable. Her silence had been her complicity. She hadn't just failed to defend him, she had failed to truly see him. After a week of painful soul-searching, she called him. Her voice was small, hesitant. "Can I see you?" They met not at their house, but at a small, anonymous cafe. Daniel looked the same, calm, composed, but the sadness in his eyes had been replaced by a watchful stillness. He was waiting. Clara didn't make excuses. She didn't blame her family. She owned her failure. "You were right," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "About everything. I was a coward. I was so afraid of their disapproval that I betrayed you. I let them define you, and I let them define our marriage. I am so sorry." Daniel listened, his expression unreadable. "Sorry for what, exactly?" he asked. It wasn't a cruel question, it was a necessary one. "Sorry for not seeing you," she said, her voice breaking. "For not trusting you. For being ashamed when I should have been proud. I valued their noise over your quiet, and I was wrong." It was the beginning, not a resolution, but the first tentative step onto a new, uncertain path. Daniel didn't offer immediate forgiveness. The wound was too deep for a simple bandage. "I believe you're sorry, Clara," he said softly, "but apologies are words. A foundation is built with actions." Meanwhile, Richard Sterling, facing a crisis he couldn't shout or buy his way out of, did something he had never done in his life. He asked for help. He came to Daniel's office. The journey itself was a penance. He had to walk past a sleek, minimalist reception area, give his name to a young, professional assistant, and wait to be admitted into the world of the man he had dismissed as a failure. When he was shown in, he stopped just inside the door, humbled by the space. The vast room, the clean lines, the view of the city. It was a physical manifestation of a success more profound and elegant than anything he had ever built. Daniel was standing by the window, just as he had been the day Forbes called. "Daniel," Richard began, his voice rough, "your office, it's incredible." "Thank you, Richard," Daniel said, turning to face him. Richard's apology was clumsy, unpracticed, but it was genuine. He didn't make excuses. He admitted his arrogance, his blindness, his jealousy. "I was wrong," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "About you, about everything. I disrespected you. I disrespected my own daughter by demeaning her husband. And now, my business is in trouble. My reputation is shot. I don't know what to do." He looked at Daniel, his eyes pleading. "I'm asking for your help." Daniel regarded him for a long moment. He saw not the tyrant from the dinner table, but a broken old man, his world in pieces around him. Vengeance had been the demolition. This was the moment for reconstruction. "I'll help you," Daniel said, "but on my terms." The final act was not about victory, but about reconstruction. Daniel's terms for helping Richard were not punitive, they were restorative. He demanded no financial stake in Richard's company, nor did he ask for a personal apology to be made public. His conditions were focused on integrity, the very principle the Sterlings had so long ignored. First, Richard had to issue a formal, public statement retracting his support for Apex Solutions, acknowledging he had been misled and endorsing a full investigation. This would clear Daniel's name professionally to any who had heard the story, but more importantly, it would force Richard to publicly admit his error in judgment. Second, Richard's company, Sterling Properties, had to implement a new, mandatory ethical charter drafted by Daniel, governing all its future dealings, with a focus on transparency and fair practice. Finally, Richard had to personally fund a series of scholarships for promising, underprivileged architecture students at the City University, a quiet, meaningful act of penance. Richard, humbled and desperate, agreed to everything. The process was painful for him, but it was also transformative. In working with Daniel to restructure his company's ethics, he began to see the world through a different lens. He saw that strength was not about shouting the loudest or paying the most, but about building things, businesses, relationships, buildings that were sound from the foundation up. Clara's journey was more personal and arduous. She did not move back into their home immediately. On Daniel's suggestion, she took a leave of absence from her job at the art gallery and started volunteering at one of the community centers Daniel's firm had designed and funded pro bono. For the first time, she was not Clara Sterling, daughter of a real estate mogul. She was just Clara, a woman helping to organize after-school programs for kids in a neighborhood her father would have called undesirable. She saw Daniel's work not as a brand or a status symbol, but as a force for good. She saw the lives he touched, the communities he strengthened. She began to understand that his success was not measured in dollars, but in the positive impact of his creations. Her actions became her apology. She was not trying to win him back with words, but by becoming a person who was worthy of his quiet integrity. After 2 months, Daniel came to visit her at the community center. He watched her for a while, unnoticed, as she patiently helped a young girl with a drawing. He saw a light in her face he hadn't seen before. Not the reflected glow of her family's wealth, but a genuine warmth that came from within. That evening, they walked together along a newly built pedestrian bridge that arched gracefully over the river. It was one of Daniel's designs, simple, elegant, and strong. "I never understood what you were building," Clara said softly, looking at the city lights reflecting on the water. "I thought it was just buildings, but you're building connections." "That's the goal," Daniel said. He stopped and took her hands. They were no longer the perfectly manicured hands of a society wife. They had a smudge of paint on the thumb. "Your father and Mark are rebuilding their company. Mark is taking night classes in business ethics. He has a long way to go, but it's a start." "And me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Can we rebuild?" Daniel looked into her eyes. He saw the shame and the regret, but he also saw a new strength, a new self-awareness. He saw a woman who had faced her own worst failings and had chosen a better path. "A foundation isn't something you build once," he said. "You have to maintain it. You have to check for cracks. You have to make sure it's strong enough to hold what you build on top of it. I think we can start." He squeezed her hands, a gesture of quiet confirmation. The Forbes article came out the following month. The cover was a striking black and white photograph of Daniel, standing not in a power suit, but in his simple work clothes, against the backdrop of the rising Phoenix Tower. The title was bold: "The Silent Architect: How Daniel Croft's Quiet Competence is Redefining the Urban Skyline." The article was a testament to his philosophy, that true worth is not in what you proclaim, but in what you build. It celebrated his integrity as much as his genius. The final image in the magazine was a smaller, candid shot. It was of Daniel and Clara, walking hand in hand across the pedestrian bridge, smiling. They looked like any other couple, happy and in love. There was no mention of her family's wealth or his immense fortune. It was just them, two people who had found their way back to each other, ready to build a future on a new and much stronger foundation. Their past was not erased, but it had become the solid ground on which they now stood. A reminder that true value is not about appearances, but about the unshakable integrity that lies beneath. And so we see that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the most powerful. True strength, like the foundations of a great building, is often silent, deep, and unseen until it is tested. Daniel's story is a reminder that our worth is not determined by the judgment of others, but by our own character, our own integrity, and the quiet, patient work we do when no one is watching. What do you think? Is forgiveness possible without consequences? Can a relationship truly be rebuilt after such a deep betrayal of trust? I'd be fascinated to read your thoughts on this in the comments below. Your perspective adds so much to these stories. If you found this journey from frustration to vindication satisfying, please give this video a like and subscribe for more stories that explore the complexities of human nature. Thank you for being here with me today, and I look forward to sharing another story with you soon.